The dust swirled around Thomas Blackwood's boots as he stood on his porch, squinting at the setting sun. His weathered face, etched with 47 years of hardship, revealed little emotion as he surveyed his modest farm. 20 acres of hard-won land in the New Mexico Territory, 1878. The silence was broken only by the occasional lowing of cattle and the persistent whisper of wind through the tall grass. Thomas adjusted his worn hat and descended the creaking wooden steps. Another day of solitude coming to an end. 6 years had passed since Sarah's death in childbirth, taking their unborn son with her. 6 years of speaking to no one but his livestock and the occasional traveling salesman. The isolation had become both his punishment and his comfort. Inside his cabin, Thomas lit an oil lamp and placed it on the rough-hewn table. The flickering light cast dancing shadows across the sparse furnishings. A bed, a trunk containing Sarah's belongings he couldn't bear to part with, and a rocking chair he'd carved during their first year of marriage. He prepared a simple meal of beans and salt pork, eating mechanically while staring at the empty chair across from him. Sleep rarely came easily to Thomas. Most nights he would lie awake, listening to the sounds of the prairie, coyotes in the distance, the subtle creaking of the cabin, the wind's mournful song. This night was no different. He tossed in his bed, haunted by memories of laughter that no longer filled his home. The first hint of dawn had just begun to lighten the sky when Thomas heard it. A sound so unexpected it jolted him upright. A woman's scream, distant but unmistakable, pierced the pre-dawn stillness. He grabbed his Winchester rifle and rushed outside, pausing on the porch to listen. "Help! Please help!" The desperate cry came from the direction of the creek that marked the eastern boundary of his property. Thomas hesitated only briefly before setting off at a run. Years of solitude had made him wary of strangers, but something in that voice, raw desperation, pulled him forward. As he crested the small hill overlooking the creek, he saw her. An Apache woman, heavily pregnant, was backing away from 2 rough-looking men on horseback. Even from this distance, Thomas could see the terror in her eyes. Her dark hair hung in disarray around her shoulders, and her simple dress was torn at the sleeve. One of the men reached for her, laughing. Without conscious thought, Thomas raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The sound cracked through the morning silence like thunder. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice rough from disuse. "The lady clearly doesn't want your company." The men turned toward him, hands hovering near their holsters. The taller one, with a scar running down his cheek, spat on the ground. "This ain't your concern, farmer. This Indian woman's a runaway. We're taking her back where she belongs." Thomas descended the hill steadily, keeping his rifle trained on the men. "Looks to me like she doesn't want to go. And since she's on my land, I reckon it is my concern." The pregnant woman used the distraction to put more distance between herself and her pursuers, moving closer to Thomas. He could see now that her face was bruised, one eye swollen. "Last chance to mind your own business," the second man warned, his hand now resting on his pistol. Thomas didn't blink. "I'm not in the habit of turning away folks in need, especially not to men who beat on women." He shifted his aim slightly, centering it on the scarred man's chest. "Now, I suggest you boys ride on, before this gets unpleasant." A tense moment passed. Thomas knew he was outnumbered, but something in his stance, the steady hands holding the rifle perhaps, or the cold determination in his eyes, gave the men pause. Finally, the scarred man jerked his head at his companion. "Ain't worth dying over some Indian squaw. She'll be dead from the elements in a week anyway." He turned his horse, but his parting words carried a clear threat. "This territory ain't big enough for folks who don't understand how things work, farmer. We'll be seeing you again." Thomas maintained his position until the men were distant specks on the horizon. Only then did he lower his rifle and turn to the woman, who had sunk to her knees, one hand pressed against her swollen belly, the other covering her mouth to stifle her sobs. "You're safe now, Mom," Thomas said awkwardly, keeping a respectful distance. "Are you hurt?" She looked up at him, fear and gratitude warring in her dark eyes. "Baby," she managed. Her English halting but clear. "Baby coming soon." As if to confirm her words, she grimaced in pain, doubling over slightly. Thomas felt a flash of panic. He knew nothing about childbirth, had deliberately avoided anything that might remind him of Sarah's death. But he couldn't leave this woman alone, especially not with those men still in the territory. "Can you walk?" he asked, offering his hand after a moment's hesitation. "My cabin's not far. You'll be safer there." She nodded, accepting his weathered hand. As he helped her to her feet, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Kiona. My name is Kiona." "Thomas Blackwood," he replied, supporting her weight as they began the slow journey back to his cabin. "Thomas." The silence that had been his only companion for years was broken, and with it, something inside Thomas shifted, like soil being turned after a long, hard winter. The cabin felt smaller with Kiona in it. Thomas had given her his bed and retreated to the porch, unsure of what to do next. The morning sun was climbing higher in the sky, promising another scorching day. He should be tending to his cattle, fixing the fence in the north pasture, or harvesting the small vegetable garden Sarah had started and he had maintained out of habit rather than necessity. Instead, he found himself pacing, his thoughts in turmoil. Who was this woman? What was her story? And what would he do when her time came? The nearest doctor was in Willow Creek, a half-day's ride away. The nearest midwife, old Mrs. Callahan, had died the previous winter. A soft moan from inside the cabin interrupted his thoughts. Thomas hesitated, then pushed open the door. Kiona was sitting up in bed, her face contorted in pain, both hands now cradling her belly. "It's coming," she said, meeting his eyes with a mix of fear and determination. "Baby, not wait." Thomas felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. "I'll ride for the doctor," he said. Already backing toward the door, Kiona shook her head vehemently. "No time, no time." She gripped the bedsheet, her knuckles white as another contraction seized her. When it passed, she fixed him with an intense gaze. "You help. I tell what to do." Thomas wanted to refuse, to flee, to escape the memories threatening to overwhelm him. But the pleading in Kiona's eyes anchored him to the spot. He had already chosen to help this woman. He couldn't abandon her now. I'll do what I can," he finally said, removing his hat and rolling up his sleeves. "But I know nothing about bringing babies into this world." A ghost of a smile touched Kiona's lips. "I know, I show you." What followed was the most harrowing and miraculous experience of Thomas's life since Sarah's death. Kiona, despite her pain, guided him with clear instructions: boil water, find clean cloths, support her back. She was strong in a way Thomas had never witnessed, gritting her teeth through contractions that would have brought a lesser person to their knees. As the sun reached its zenith, Kiona's labor intensified. Thomas found himself kneeling beside the bed holding her hand, offering awkward words of encouragement that seemed inadequate against her suffering. When she screamed, the sound cut through him like a knife, bringing back terrible memories he'd tried so hard to bury. "I can't," he whispered, more to himself than to her as sweat dripped from his brow. "I can't do this again." Kiona's grip on his hand tightened painfully. "You can," she insisted between ragged breaths. "We can. Baby coming now." And indeed, Thomas could see the crown of the child's head. Panic gave way to a strange calm as instinct took over. Following Kiona's gasped instructions, he positioned himself to receive the infant. "Push," he urged, his voice stronger now. "Push, Kiona." With a final primal cry, Kiona bore down. Thomas felt the weight of the baby slide into his waiting hands, a slippery, squirming miracle that represented everything he had lost and perhaps something he had never expected to find again. For a heartbeat, the infant was silent, and Thomas felt his chest constrict with fear. Then, as if gathering strength for the journey ahead, the baby drew a deep breath and released a powerful wail that filled the small cabin. "A boy," Thomas said, his voice cracking as he quickly wrapped the infant in a clean cloth. "You have a son, Kiona." Tears streamed down Kiona's exhausted face as Thomas placed the crying bundle on her chest. She touched the baby's cheek with trembling fingers, murmuring soft words in Apache that Thomas couldn't understand, but somehow felt in his soul. Thomas stepped back, overwhelmed by conflicting emotions: relief that both mother and child had survived, grief for his own lost family, and something else, something he hadn't felt in years, a tentative, fragile sense of purpose. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the land. The silence that had defined Thomas's existence had been irrevocably broken by a woman's desperate cry for help and a newborn's first breath. As he washed the blood from his hands in a basin of water, Thomas Blackwood knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Days passed with a rhythm Thomas had almost forgotten could exist. The care of Kiona and her son, whom she named Ahote, meaning restless one, gave structure to hours that had previously blended together in solitary sameness. He found himself rising earlier, working with renewed purpose and returning to the cabin not out of habit, but because someone was waiting for him. Kiona recovered quickly, displaying a resilience that Thomas admired. By the fourth day, she was insisting on helping with small tasks around the cabin. Despite his gruff protests, she moved with grace despite her recent ordeal, keeping the baby close in a sling she fashioned from one of Sarah's old shawls. Thomas had offered it hesitantly, half expecting to feel a pang of resentment, but instead found a strange comfort in seeing the fabric repurposed for new life. As they shared the evening meal on the fifth day, Thomas finally asked the question that had been hovering between them. "Those men," he began, watching Kiona's face carefully. "Who were they? Why were they after you?" Kiona's expression darkened, her hands automatically moving to cradle Ahote, who slept peacefully against her chest. For a moment, Thomas thought she wouldn't answer and he wouldn't have pressed her. But then she met his gaze steadily. "I was servant at ranch," she explained, her English improving daily through their conversations. "Master of house, he—" She struggled for the words, then simply placed a hand on her swollen belly. "He father of Ahote." Thomas's jaw tightened as understanding dawned. "And his wife found out," he guessed. Kiona nodded. "She very angry. Not at husband, at me." A bitter smile touched her lips. "Always the woman who is blamed. So you ran." "When I know baby coming soon, yes, I run." She looked down at her son, her expression softening. For him, not want him to be slave too. Thomas absorbed this information in silence, feeling a slow burn of anger toward the ranch owner and his wife. He'd heard similar stories before. Native women treated as property, children born of such unions raised as servants if they were acknowledged at all. "Those men," he said finally, "they work for the ranch owner?" "Yes, bounty hunters, paid to bring me back." Fear flickered across Kiona's features. "They will come again." "I know this." Thomas nodded, having reached the same conclusion. The threat had been clear in the scarred man's parting words. "We'll be ready for them," he said simply. Kiona studied him, her dark eyes unreadable. "Why you help me, Thomas Blackwood? Most white men would not." The question caught him off guard. Why had he intervened? Why had he brought a strange woman, an Apache woman no less, into his home? In a territory where tensions between settlers and native tribes still ran high, his actions could be seen as foolish at best, treasonous at worst. "My wife," he found himself saying, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "Sarah. She died bringing our son into the world, 6 years ago." He stared into the fire, remembering. "I couldn't save them, either of them. But when I heard you screaming for help, I couldn't let it happen again. Not if I could stop it." Kiona was silent for a long moment. Then, with Ahote still cradled in one arm, she reached across the table and placed her free hand over Thomas's. The touch was light, almost tentative, but it sent a jolt through him. How long had it been since he'd felt human contact? "I am sorry for your loss," she said softly, "but grateful for your courage." Thomas cleared his throat, suddenly uncomfortable with the intimacy of the moment. He withdrew his hand and stood, moving to the window to check the approaching darkness. "We should be prepared," he said, changing the subject. "If those men return, they won't come alone." Kiona accepted the shift in conversation without comment. "I can shoot," she offered. "My father taught me before white soldiers took our land." Thomas raised an eyebrow, reassessing her. "Good. We may need every advantage." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the cabin in golden light, Thomas realized that for the first time in years, he was thinking in terms of we instead of I. The change was both unsettling and strangely comforting, like finding a path he'd forgotten existed. That night, as Kiona and Ahote slept in his bed and Thomas kept watch from the rocking chair, rifle across his knees, he contemplated the unexpected turn his life had taken. A week ago, he had been a man sleepwalking through existence, each day indistinguishable from the last. Now, he was harboring a fugitive and her newborn son, preparing to defend them against men who saw them as property to be reclaimed. Outside, the familiar sounds of the night wrapped around the cabin, coyotes hunting in the distance, the soft rustling of wind through grass. But within those walls, something had changed. The silence that had been Thomas's constant companion was gone, replaced by the gentle breathing of a woman and her child. And the steady beat of his own heart, awakening after a long dormancy. The attack came at dawn, just as Thomas had predicted. He'd been dozing in the chair when a sound, too deliberate to be wildlife, too cautious to be innocent, snapped him to alertness. Beside him, Kiona was already awake, her body tense as she listened. "They're here," she whispered, reaching for the rifle Thomas had shown her how to use the previous day. Ahote was securely wrapped and hidden in a small hollow beneath the floorboards, a space Thomas had created years ago to store valuables, now serving as a makeshift shelter for the infant. Thomas moved to the window, staying to the side to avoid being silhouetted against the growing light. The ranch owner's men had been smarter than he'd given them credit for. Instead of approaching directly, they had split up, surrounding the cabin. He counted at least 5 figures moving through the pre-dawn mist. 5 of them, he murmured to Kiona. 2 at the back, 3 coming up from the front, the scarred ones leading them. Kiona's face hardened with determination. What his plan? Thomas considered their options, which were limited at best. They were outnumbered, and while the cabin's thick walls provided some protection, they couldn't withstand a determined assault for long. "We need to get to the barn," he decided. "There's a horse already saddled. If we can create enough confusion, you could slip away with Ahote." Kiona shook her head firmly. "Not leaving you alone." "This isn't a discussion," Thomas said, checking his ammunition. "Your son needs you. I'm just buying you time." A stubborn look crossed Kiona's face. But before she could argue further, a voice called out from outside. "Blackwood, we know you're in there with the Indian woman. Send her out, and maybe we'll forget about your interference." Thomas recognized the voice of the scarred man. "I'll handle this," he told Kiona, then raised his voice to respond. "She's not property to be sent anywhere. You're trespassing on my land. I suggest you leave while you still can." A harsh laugh answered him. "Your land? This territory belongs to men who understand the natural order of things. Last chance, Blackwood. Send out the squaw and her bastard or we burn you out." Thomas's grip tightened on his rifle. He'd expected threats, but the mention of fire changed the calculation. The cabin would go up like tinder in the dry summer heat. "When I start shooting," he whispered to Kiona, "you run for the barn. Don't look back. Don't hesitate. Just get Ahote and go." Kiona stared at him, conflict evident in her eyes. Then, in a movement that caught Thomas completely by surprise, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was brief but fierce, conveying what words could not. "I return for you," she promised as she pulled away. "This not goodbye." Before Thomas could respond, the sound of breaking glass filled the air as a flaming torch crashed through the window on the opposite side of the cabin. Smoke immediately began to fill the small space. "Now!" Thomas shouted, positioning himself at the door. He kicked it open and fired 3 rapid shots, not aiming to kill, but to create confusion and cover. Kiona moved like a shadow, retrieving Ahote from his hiding place and darting through the door, while Thomas laid down suppressive fire. He caught a glimpse of her running low toward the barn before a bullet splintered the doorframe inches from his head. Thomas ducked back inside, coughing as the smoke thickened. The fire was spreading faster than he'd anticipated, catching on the dry wood of the cabin walls. He had seconds, not minutes, to make his next move. Making a split-second decision, Thomas grabbed Sarah's photograph from the mantel, the one possession he couldn't bear to lose, and plunged through the smoke, toward the back window. Glass shattered around him as he crashed through, landing hard on the ground outside. Gunfire erupted immediately. A bullet grazed his arm, sending a streak of fire across his flesh. Thomas rolled behind the water trough, returning fire when he could. His mind was focused on one thing, giving Kiona and Ahote enough time to escape. From his position, he could see the barn. The door was open, but there was no sign of movement. Had she made it? Was she already riding away? The thought gave him strength as he reloaded his rifle with hands that remained surprisingly steady. The scarred man was shouting orders, directing his men to surround Thomas's position. The cabin was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the sky in angry orange fingers. 6 years of memories burning away. Thomas fired again, satisfaction coursing through him as one of the attackers fell with a cry of pain. 4 left. The odds were still poor, but better than before, if he could just hold them off a little longer. A movement caught his eye. A rider emerging from the far side of the barn, bent low over the horse's neck, Kiona with Ahote secured against her. She was taking the route they had discussed, through the ravine where pursuing riders would be forced to slow down. Relief flooded through Thomas, momentarily distracting him. It was enough for one of the attackers to get a clear shot. Pain exploded in Thomas's shoulder as the bullet found its mark, spinning him backward. His rifle clattered to the ground as he fought to remain conscious. Through a haze of pain, he saw the scarred man approaching, pistol drawn, and aimed at Thomas's chest. Behind him, the cabin, Thomas's home for over a decade, collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber. "Should have minded your own business, Blackwood," the man said, standing over him. "Now you've lost everything for some Indian whore and her half-breed brat." Thomas looked up at him, a strange calm settling over him, despite the pain and the certainty that he was about to die. "You're wrong," he managed, tasting blood. "I found something. After years of nothing but ghosts and regrets, I found something worth fighting for." The scarred man's face twisted in disgust. "Your sympathy for these savages is sickening. Men like you are why this territory's going soft." "Men like me," Thomas replied, his voice growing weaker, "are why there's still hope for this territory." The man raised his pistol, preparing to fire the killing shot. Thomas closed his eyes, bracing for the impact. Instead, the crack of a rifle split the air, and the scarred man jerked backward, a look of surprise freezing on his face before he crumpled to the ground. Thomas turned his head with effort, following the direction of the shot. What he saw made him wonder if he was already dead and dreaming. Kiona stood at the edge of the clearing, rifle raised, her face a mask of cold fury. Beside her was not just Ahote, but 3 mounted Apache warriors, their expressions equally grim as they surveyed the scene. The remaining attackers, seeing their leader fall and faced with unexpected reinforcements, turned and fled. One was brought down by an arrow from one of the warriors, the others disappeared into the brush. As consciousness began to slip away from him, Thomas saw Kiona running toward him, her face transforming from warrior to healer in an instant. The last thing he felt before darkness claimed him was her gentle hands on his face and the sound of her voice, urgent but steady, speaking words he couldn't understand, but somehow knew were promises of life, not death. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness for what seemed like days. Fragmented memories surfaced through the fog of pain and fever, being carried on a travois. Kiona's cool hands changing bandages, the sound of a language he didn't understand but found oddly comforting. Sometimes in moments of greater clarity, he would see Ahote being held above him, the baby's curious eyes studying his face. When Thomas finally awoke fully, he was in a dwelling he didn't recognize. Not his cabin, that was gone, burned to ashes, but a traditional Apache wickiup. The circular structure was surprisingly cool despite the summer heat, the framework of branches covered with brush and hides. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his shoulder. A small sound escaped him, and almost instantly the entrance flap was pushed aside as Kiona entered, Ahote securely wrapped against her chest. "You awake," she said, relief evident in her voice. "Good. You sleep too long." Thomas managed a weak smile. "How long?" 4 days, Kiona replied, kneeling beside him to check his bandages. Her touch was gentle but confident. Bullet went through clean, no poisoning of blood. You are strong, Thomas Blackwood. Thomas absorbed this information, then asked the question that had been forming in his mind since he glimpsed the Apache warriors. Your people, they came for you? Kiona nodded, sitting back on her heels. My brother Nakohi tracked me from ranch, found me at your cabin, but saw you protect me. He watch, wait. When men attack, he bring others. And they brought us here, Thomas guessed, looking around at the unfamiliar dwelling. Where is here exactly? Safe place, Kiona said simply. Hidden valley where some of my people live free. Away from soldiers, away from reservations. Thomas processed this, understanding the immense trust being shown to him. Few white men had ever seen free Apache encampments and lived to tell of it. Your brother, he must not be happy about a white man in your camp. A small smile touched Kiona's lips. Not happy, no, but he respect man who fight for Apache woman and child. He say you have warrior's heart even if your skin is pale. Thomas wasn't sure how to respond to that. He had never thought of himself as a warrior, just a farmer, a widower, a man who had been sleepwalking through life until a desperate cry for help had awakened something within him. My cabin, he said, changing the subject. My land. Kiona's expression softened with sympathy. All gone. Men burned everything. Thomas closed his eyes, absorbing the loss. Everything he and Sarah had built together, every physical reminder of their life, reduced to ashes. Yet strangely, the grief he expected didn't come. Instead, he felt an odd sense of liberation, as if the fire had burned away more than just timber and possessions. What happens now? He asked, opening his eyes to find Kiona watching him intently. You heal, she said firmly. Then, she hesitated, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. Then you choose. Choose? Kiona gestured toward the camp outside. My people say you can stay until safe to travel. They give you horse, supplies to reach nearest town. She paused, then added more softly, or you stay here, with me, with Ahote. The offer hung in the air between them, weighty with implications. Thomas studied Kiona's face, seeing both strength and vulnerability there. In the short time he had known her, she had shown more courage and determination than most men he had encountered in his life. Your people would accept that, he asked, finding it hard to believe. A white man living among them? Not all, Kiona admitted, but you shed blood protecting Apache woman and child. That means something, she smiled slightly, and Nakohi say you too stubborn to be typical white man. Despite his pain, Thomas found himself chuckling. Your brother might be right about that. A comfortable silence fell between them. Outside, Thomas could hear the sounds of the camp, children laughing, dogs barking, the rhythmic pounding of someone working with a mortar and pestle, sounds of life, of community, of belonging. Sounds he had forgotten in his years of self-imposed isolation. I don't know if I remember how to live among people, he confessed, voicing the fear that had suddenly gripped him. It's been just me for so long. Kiona reached out, her hand finding his. You remember, she said with quiet confidence. When you heard me call for help, you remember. When you delivered Ahote, you remember. The heart does not forget how to care, Thomas Blackwood. It only sleeps until awakened. Thomas looked at their intertwined hands, her smooth copper skin against his weathered palm. Then his gaze shifted to Ahote, sleeping peacefully against his mother's chest. The child who had come into the world in his cabin, whose first cries had broken 6 years of silence. I'll stay, he said, the decision feeling right as soon as the words left his mouth. If your people will have me, I'll stay. Kiona's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. They will see what I see, she said. Man with good heart. Man who brings life, not death. She squeezed his hand gently. Rest now. Tomorrow, when you're stronger, I introduce you to my family, new beginning. As Kiona left the wiki up, promising to return with food, Thomas settled back against the bedding. His shoulder throbbed, a constant reminder of how close he had come to death. Yet he felt more alive than he had in years. The silence that had been his constant companion was gone, replaced by the sounds of a community he was being invited to join. The solitude that had both punished and protected him had been shattered by a woman's desperate cry for help and a baby's first breath. Outside, the sun was setting over mountains he didn't yet know the names of. Tomorrow would bring pain as his body continued to heal, uncertainty as he navigated his place among Kiona's people, and undoubtedly challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But it would also bring Kiona's smile, Ahote's curious eyes, and the chance to build something new from the ashes of his old life. Thomas Blackwood, former solitary farmer of the New Mexico Territory, closed his eyes and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of his new beginning. For the first time in 6 years, the silence within him was truly broken, replaced by something he had thought lost forever: hope. Spring came to the hidden valley, painting the landscape in vibrant greens and delicate wildflowers that transformed the winter-brown earth. Thomas stood at the edge of the small field he had helped clear, surveying the newly planted corn with satisfaction. 9 months had passed since he had first awoken in Kiona's wickiup, uncertain of his place in this Apache community, but determined to find one. The journey had not been easy. Some of the tribe had viewed him with suspicion or outright hostility, particularly the elders who remembered all too well the broken promises and violence of white settlers. Thomas had understood their wariness and had not pushed for acceptance, instead letting his actions speak for him. He had worked alongside the men, learning their hunting techniques while sharing his knowledge of farming. He had endured their tests of endurance without complaint, even when his wounded shoulder screamed in protest. And gradually, respect had been earned, if not full trust. Nah-Kohei, Kiona's brother, had been his harshest critic, and paradoxically, his strongest advocate. The Apache warrior had watched Thomas with eagle-sharp eyes, challenging him at every turn, but also defending his presence to those who would have driven him away. "You are not one of us," Nah-Kohei had told him bluntly one evening as they sat by the fire. "You never will be. But you fought for my sister when no one else would. That makes you family even with your pale skin and strange ways." Coming from Nah-Kohei, it had been high praise indeed. As for Kiona and Ahote, they had become the center of Thomas's world. The boy was crawling now, a bundle of energy that kept them both constantly vigilant. His first word had been Ama, mother in Apache, but his second had been Tom, a sound that had filled Thomas with a fierce joy he hadn't thought possible. Kiona had taught Thomas her language, laughing at his clumsy pronunciation, but praising his persistence. In return, he had shared stories of his life before, of Sarah, of the farm they had built together, of the dreams that had died with her. Kiona had listened without judgment, helping him honor those memories while creating new ones. Their relationship had evolved slowly, respect becoming friendship, friendship deepening into something more. The first time Thomas had kissed her, truly kissed her, not in the desperate moment before battle, but in the quiet of a summer evening, he had felt as if a final piece of himself had slid into place. They had been married in the Apache way during the winter solstice, a simple ceremony that acknowledged what everyone in the camp already knew, that they had chosen each other, not out of convenience or necessity, but out of a love that had grown from the unlikeliest of beginnings. Now, as Thomas turned from the cornfield to walk back to their wickiup, larger than Kiona's original dwelling, built with his own hands under Nah-Kohei's critical guidance, he reflected on the strange path his life had taken. 6 years of isolation and grief, shattered by a woman's cry for help, a cabin burned to ashes, a new home risen from the loss, a family found in the people he had been taught to fear. Kiona was waiting for him, Ahote balanced on her hip. The boy had grown strong and alert, his eyes dark like his mother's but shaped somehow like Thomas's, taking in everything with boundless curiosity. When he spotted Thomas, he reached out with chubby hands, demanding to be held. "He miss you," Kiona said, handing the squirming child over. "Always watching for you." Thomas took Ahote, settling him comfortably in the crook of his arm. "The corn is planted," he reported, should grow well in that soil. Kiona nodded, satisfaction in her expression. The success of the small farm they had established was a source of pride for both of them, a blending of their cultures that benefited the entire community. "Nakohe returned," she said, her tone shifting to something more serious. "He bring news." Thomas's attention sharpened. Kiona's brother had been away for several weeks, scouting the movements of soldiers and settlers in the territory. His reports were crucial for the safety of their hidden community. "What news?" "Soldiers building new fort, 2 days' ride from here," Kiona said, her expression troubled. "And ranch owner who hunted me, he is dead. Fever took him in winter." Thomas absorbed this information, feeling a complex mix of emotions. The new fort represented a potential threat to their sanctuary. As for the ranch owner's death, he felt no satisfaction in it, only a somber acknowledgement that one chapter had truly closed. "Does Nakohe think we need to move the camp?" he asked, concerned about the proximity of the soldiers. Kiona shook her head. "Not yet. Valley still hidden well, but we must be more careful." She hesitated, then added, "Some talk of joining relatives on reservation, say fighting becoming too hard, too dangerous." Thomas understood the dilemma. The free Apache bands were dwindling as more were forced onto reservations or killed resisting. The hidden valley had provided sanctuary, but for how long? The inexorable push of westward expansion threatened to reach even this remote haven eventually. "What do you think?" he asked, knowing that whatever decision came, they would face it together. Kiona looked out over the valley, her expression pensive. "This is home now. For me, for Ahote." Her eyes met his. "For you. We fight for it as long as possible." Thomas nodded, shifting Ahote to his other arm as the boy began to fuss. "Then we prepare, make contingency plans, ensure everyone can move quickly if needed." The practicalities of survival were never far from their minds, even in moments of peace. It was the reality of their existence, this precarious balance between the life they had built and the forces that threatened it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, Thomas and Kiona sat outside their wickiup, watching Ahote play with a wooden toy Nakohe had carved for him. The distant sound of singing drifted from the center of the camp, where the evening meal was being prepared. "Do you ever regret it?" Kiona asked suddenly, her voice soft. "Choosing this life?" Thomas looked at her, surprised by the question. "Never," he said without hesitation. "Not for a single moment." And it was true. Despite the hardships, despite the constant vigilance, despite the knowledge that their future was uncertain, Thomas had found something in this hidden valley that had eluded him for most of his life. Belonging. The silence that had once been his only companion was now filled with Ahote's laughter, Kiona's stories, the rhythms of a community that had, against all odds, accepted him as one of their own. The solitude that had both punished and protected him had been replaced by connections that ran deep and true. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Thomas reached for Kiona's hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Ahote crawled into his mother's lap, yawning widely, his small body warm against them both. The silence of the plains had been broken, and in its place Thomas Blackwood had found his voice, his heart, and his home. Not in the land of his birth or among his own kind, but in a hidden valley with a woman who had once cried out for help, and a child who represented hope in its purest form. It was not the life he had planned, not the future he had envisioned during those long, lonely years on his farm. It was something far richer, far more precious, a second chance he had never expected and would forever be grateful for. As night fell completely, wrapping the valley in a blanket of stars, Thomas held his family close and listened to the sounds of his new life. No longer a stranger to happiness, no longer a solitary figure haunted by silence. The plains had taught him solitude, Kiona and Ahote had taught him connection, and in that balance he had finally found peace.